Joining me now is Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff. Last week, he advanced to a November runoff in the race for U.S. Senate. Congratulations on your victory in the primary race. I know you still have a general election ahead, but there's just so much to get to. And I really wanted to start here with the immunity claim, because Donald Trump, we've seen this playbook before many, many times. We've seen this movie before. But this trial is supposed to start in 2 weeks. Is it possible it could be delayed beyond that simply because of his immunity claim here?
It is possible, and this has been Trump's modus operandi from the very beginning: delay, 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 in the hope that justice delayed can be justice denied. But there are a couple absurdities about this. First, the whole argument that as a president you're immune somehow, that even if you try to overturn the election, the ultimate check on presidential power, the election, that somehow you're immune, which would be an open invitation to any president in the future to do the same. That claim is going to fall even with the Supreme Court. But what he's hoping for a delay. It is even more absurd, though, in the case of this New York prosecution, because one other requirement of even making this claim is the acts have to be official in nature. Well, what kind of an office was he holding if writing hush money payments to a porn star was part of the job description?
Some office.
I guess so. So it's an absurdity, but this has worked for him. We litigated against him to get the Deutsche Bank records. He strung that out for years. The Oversight Committee litigated against him to get the accounting firm Mazars records of his. He strung that out for years. And he's hoping to string this out past the presidential campaign. And
there's a lot of money he owes in judgments that have already been made. I do want to play, and I mentioned this in the opening, he continues to attack E.J. and Carroll. So I want to play a little bit of what he said and get your response to that.
Miss Bergdorf Goodman, a person I never met. I have no idea who she is, except one thing. I got sued. From that point on, I said, wow, that's crazy what this is. I got charged. I was given a false accusation and had to post a $91 million bond on a false accusation.
I mean, he had self-control for like a second there. I mean, do you hear that as meeting the bar of defaming? And do you think if you're Robbie Kaplan, you should act on that?
It certainly could. I mean, a jury could certainly conclude he's at it again. And what's more, the fact that he keeps having these judgments against him is just further evidence that he knows what he's doing is wrong. He knows he's defaming someone. It just cumulatively adds to the proof against him. But it also shows both that, you know, you got to be either stupid or crazy to keep doing the same thing that is costing you, or both, millions. But it also shows, no matter what he's instructed by his lawyers or anyone else, he just can't control himself. And you certainly don't want someone in the Oval Office who has no impulse control, not when they have the finger on the button, as in addition to many other things.
One of the things that's been concerning to me, and you've spoken a lot in the past about where the money is coming from and how we should be watching that, is, you know, he just made one payment, a bond payment, in one of these cases, in the E.J. Carroll case. He owes a whole lot more money in the New York civil fraud case. We don't necessarily know who co-signed, if anyone co-signed. There aren't a lot of limitations on who can pay for this. How concerned are you about that and somebody having kind of leverage over somebody who might be sitting in the Oval Office?
I'm very concerned about it. I think all Americans should be concerned that someone could potentially have leverage to the tune of tens or hundreds of millions of dollars over the president of the United States. But even more broadly, what we've seen of Donald Trump, whether it was his efforts to build Moscow Trump Tower and his lies to the American people about it, or his son-in-law's dealing with the Gulf nations, this is someone who will use the Oval Office, if he ever gets the chance, as essentially a cash cow. If we think the emoluments and enrichments and the stays at Trump Hotel and all the rest of that were troubling and violative of the Constitution and conflicts of interest, that is child's play, considering what he may do if he's at risk of losing everything, which he is right now. He's at risk of losing everything. This is someone always motivated by greed, and the fact that whether it's Russia or the Gulf or other nations, that he could be so desperate to recoup his money that he'd be willing to do anything, sell out the country, ought to be of grave concern to us.
And any of those powers, as I understand it, could pay in some way or help him pay for bond payments in these cases where he owes money, where the judgments have already been made.
Well, they could, and if passed as prologue, to get those records, to find out, who may be signing these or who may be guaranteeing these loans, could take years.
Let me ask you about, you've spent a lot of time in the national security space, and it's worth restating how bizarre it is that the week he essentially secured the nomination, he decided to meet with Prime Minister Orbán. Today, Orbán said Trump, quote, will not get a penny to Ukraine if elected, which is telling. It's going even farther than Trump has. What do you make of the fact that we're getting more from the leader of Hungary than Trump on what his plans are? And is that kind of confirm what you already thought or make you even more concerned?
Both. It confirms, the worst fears we have about Trump. But, here's someone who, in Viktor Orbán, is kind of a proxy enabler stooge of Vladimir Putin on the one hand. On the other hand, as you were pointing out, has dismantled his own democracy. So these are birds of a feather, exactly what Donald Trump wants to do. And you're precisely right. This doesn't show Trump's strength that he emulates these dictators. It shows his weakness. He wants to be them because he lacks power. He's a weak figure, and he emulates these strong men. He aspires to be like them. He has disdain for our democratic allies. No wonder NATO is terrified. But here's the good news in all of this. NATO is enlarging. NATO is growing. NATO is becoming stronger. Notwithstanding what Putin did, notwithstanding what Trump is threatening, NATO is growing, and thank God it is. And thank God we have a President, Joe Biden, who recognizes the value of NATO and how NATO has kept our nation safe. It's going to be, in many respects, a very clear contrast between these two candidates for president. But in no area more than national security does Joe Biden shine in supporting this international rules-based order, which has kept our country safe. And in no other way does Donald Trump endanger us than when it comes to NATO and national security.
It's such an interesting place to pay attention to. And you and I both share a love of national security issues. There was another report. There was a lot of reporting over the last 24 hours. Former Trump Chief of Staff John Kelly said this to CNN. My theory on why he likes the dictator so much is that's who he is. Every incumbent president is shocked that they actually have so little power without going to Congress, which is a good thing. It's Civics 101. But in this case, he was shocked that he didn't have dictatorial powers to send U.S. forces places or to move money around with the budget. And he looked at Putin and Xi and that nutcase in North Korea as people who were like him in terms of being a tough guy, which sort of confirms. He was his chief of staff, what we all think. But what do you make of those comments from John Kelly? Well,
it kind of harkens back to Trump saying that under Article 2, he could do whatever the hell he wants. He has no interest in our institutions and our democracy. All he wants is power. And the tragedy is that what has made him possible, in the first term, what makes him still viable, is so many of the people I serve with on the Republican side of the aisle, also, as it turns out, all they care about is power, too. And notwithstanding that they think he's a danger, notwithstanding they think he's unethical and immoral and a liar, they will line up behind him. They've lined up behind him before. Mitch McConnell, who said basically he wasn't going to impeach because there were other remedies like prosecution, just lined up behind him again. All it is about power. And this is what has our democracy hanging by a thread.